Hi there, and welcome to Business Tips with Michael Tobian. Today's discussion is an introduction to verbal and written agreements. Thanks for joining this discussion today. If you have a service business, your entire business is contracts and agreements. Even if you don't fill out and sign offers with your clients, you are engaging in verbal agreements where you discuss the price, terms, what services you offer, some kind of a completion schedule, and you set expectations between you and your client. Sometimes agreements are in writing and sometimes they aren't. So we're going to discuss the pros and cons in these different approaches. First off, let me just say that I am not an attorney, and so I'm going to be discussing general concepts about agreements and what kinds of things have been helpful for me in my businesses based on my experience. And I'll go over some mistakes that I've done and have kind of corrected in my contracts and mistakes I've made in these areas to give you some insight on what you might avoid when you are creating your contracts and putting together your agreements. Every business is different and every situation and industry is different. So please make friends with an attorney and an accountant to get their advice on specific things to include in your agreements for your business, because they're going to be totally different than my experience. I've been in a lot of different industries, and each industry and each business has totally separate things that are important to me for that specific business and the agreements that we deal with. So, to start off, do agreements need to be in writing? The answer is no. Many agreements are not in writing. I think of when I hire a plumber or when I hire my piano tuner a couple times a year, or if I hire a graphic designer to create a logo or something like that. Small jobs, I typically don't enter into a signed contract with these service providers. In fact, usually it's verbal. I sometimes don't even have a text conversation. I call up my plumber and I say, hey, can you come over and fix this? And he says, sure, and he does it. And he just knows that I'm going to pay him at the end of the service. I'm currently hiring some painters to paint my house upstairs, which if you hear any noises banging around, it's those guys. But I've not signed anything with them. We've had a little bit of text communication. They printed out a quote for me. It's a significant amount of money at several $1,000s. But I've not signed anything, and they're currently upstairs painting. I've not given them a deposit or anything. But I'm good for it, and I'm going to pay it, and I think they understand that. Some contracts are in writing, but they're not signed. Sometimes this is in the form of a text or email where you go back and forth and you agree on something, but nobody actually signed and dated anything. These are less formal, but they have a paper trail, and they're typically enforceable in some kind of a dispute. Usually these don't get very specific, but they might outline generally what was agreed upon. Some contracts are signed and are formal agreements. Usually this is for higher dollar services. I, for example, do a contract with almost everything that I provide. Most of my businesses deal with high dollar services. I provide event entertainment, and it's a significant amount of money to the client. They're hiring expensive entertainers for large events, upscale weddings, sometimes celebrity weddings, conventions and corporate events all over the world. Well, we better get a contract in writing because we're purchasing airline tickets and we're paying people and making commitments. I need it in writing that they're going to pay us. So why should or shouldn't you put your agreements in writing? Well, there's lots of considerations for each situation. First off, it's difficult to prove that you've made an agreement unless you have it in writing. If there's a dispute, it's one person's word against the other. Somebody could simply state that they didn't make that agreement, and it's going to be very difficult to enforce. Another thing is that people forget what they agreed to. Sometimes two parties have very integritous expectations and trust between the two relationships, but they forget what they've agreed to. I've dealt with this before. I've had an agreement with somebody, and down the road a few years we said, no, we said this, no, we said this. Well, if we would have just put it in writing, it would have solved it. This individual's a good friend of mine. We still have a great working relationship, but we had a little dispute and we just had to figure it out because we didn't write anything down. Sometimes assumptions are made that both parties don't agree with. So you might make an agreement verbally and one party says, wait, I thought we meant in this situation it would be fine to do this, and the other party says, no, it's always going to be this case. Well, if you put everything in writing, everybody reads it and they are very clear as far as what those terms are. Let me give you an example of an agreement I had where some assumptions were made, and the problem was my contract wasn't clear enough. I provide entertainment for events, and I require a non-refundable retainer or deposit that's paid upfront so that we can reserve those entertainers for that event. Well, I once had a client who booked the entertainment, and we booked it, and we reserved the date, but this client never ended up paying that retainer or the deposit. And at some point way far down the road, this client canceled the event. And I told him, well, unfortunately, we've been turning down work for that date, so we're going to need to keep your retainer. But he had not paid it. And I told him, yeah, you may have not paid it, but the contract is clear that that retainer is still due because we've retained the date. There was consideration, we've retained the date. And he said, no, we never had an agreement because we never had that retainer paid. And he considered the retainer consideration for the contract. Well, we had a disagreement about that. I felt that the contract was still valid without that retainer, and he felt that the retainer made the contract valid because the retainer was the consideration for the contract. Well, we worked out a solution. But what I immediately did after that was I revised my contract to say that the retainer is due immediately upon booking. And if that retainer is not paid immediately, it is still due if the client cancels down the road. So there's no more question. Down the road, if I have a client canceled and I had retained that date with the entertainment, they still owe that deposit that they never paid because we provided consideration by retaining that date. So that's an example of some assumptions that were made by both of us. I'm not sure it was anyone's fault. The contract wasn't clear enough, and I revised the contract so I don't run into that problem anymore. Another thing written contracts do is they clarify who is making the agreement. So I might be talking to somebody, but that person might be an agent of a business. They might be representing the business, and they might not personally be agreeing to a particular set of terms. Well, a contract will state exactly who the contracting parties are. On the other end, as the service provider, is my company making the agreement or am I as a person making the agreement? It's unclear if you don't have anything in writing. So who's making the agreement is something that contracts clarify. What if nobody claims to have been the responsible party? Well, that's where you have a disagreement that a written contract would have solved. Let me give you an example of where I ran into an issue in this regard. I once signed a contract with a customer who represented a company, and this was my entertainment business, we reserved entertainment for that company. Well, right before the event happened, they canceled. And I said, you can't cancel, we've been reserving this date. You can, but you're gonna lose your deposit. And they said, oh, we're not gonna pay it. Well, I reached out to this, and then this person disappeared. I reached out to the company, I said, you had somebody sign this contract, we need to work something out. And they said, this person doesn't work for us. Well, it turns out that person did not work for that company and had no association with that company. They fraudulently signed the agreement representing another company. So this company that was responsible never ended up being legally liable because this person didn't even represent them. They were fraudulently signing. So I went back to that person. I finally got a hold of that person and I said, you have engaged in fraud. You're representing this company, but you don't. So you are legally responsible for this obligation. Well, anyway, we are compassionate, so we worked something out with them. But that, can you imagine without a contract, what a mess that would have been? The contract made it very clear that this person had engaged in fraud. Another thing written contracts do is they dictate what happens in the event of a dispute. A lot of times they'll say exactly where the dispute is handled. It could be in this county or in this state. Who pays for attorney costs? Laws vary based on location, in regards to who pays for each other's attorney costs, or do you pay for your own attorney costs? Well, sometimes contracts can outline and dictate that specifically in certain areas. Different areas have different laws according to this, and different countries have different laws. There are some advantages, perhaps, to not having a written contract. One, it might be a hassle and a time management issue. If you're doing a lot of service jobs and the rate isn't very high, well, it might not be worth it to you to do a contract. I have an uncle that has a carpet cleaning business. Well, he doesn't do a contract with every client because he's charging $100 or $200 at a time. My fiance has a cleaning business. She has regular clients that she cleans their houses or their apartments or Airbnbs every week or every other week. Well, there's enough trust in the relationship that they're going to get paid. And if somebody doesn't pay, well, they'll just never do business with them, and maybe they were out $100. But it's not worth drawing up a contract every time. So that's a decision that you're going to have to make. You need to determine the pros and cons, hassle versus being very clear in terms of expectations and enforceability. I suspect in these situations, if either of them had a huge commercial job that was high dollar amount, they probably would sign a contract because it's too much money to risk. All right, contracts with vendors, contractors, partners, and things like that. Most of the time, these relationships have written agreements. They're long-term, usually high dollar kind of relationships. Now, when we hire an independent contractor for my event company, we have them sign a very clear written agreement that they are not an employee with our company. They provide their own tools, they have their own business, and it outlines many things that set expectations that they don't represent or work with our company. We are hiring them as an independent contractor. And we won't pay any vendors unless they've signed this agreement, because we want it to be very clear that the relationship is separate from our company, that they aren't employees. And it's a good thing because I've been audited by Workforce Services and I've been audited by my state tax commission. And in both cases, having those agreements and being meticulous about having them sign those before we engage in the service or pay them has saved us from having to pay employer-side taxes for these independent contractors. One of the auditors even told me at the end of the audit, he says, it's a great agreement and it really helped with the audit and it saved your butt, basically, because it's very clear that these are not independent contractors. And if any of them claimed to be, we can point out and say, we were very clear about this relationship from the beginning. You have your own business. So it was very clear that they had an independent contractor relationship. Sometimes people do a handshake agreement with these types of relationships. I don't know that it's usually advisable, but I've done handshake agreements a lot too, and it requires a lot of trust, and there are definite downsides. The only reason I've done it is just because I hadn't, in these situations, got around to writing an agreement. Not a good thing. It's a laziness on my end, but I have done it. Just realize that asking to sign a contract is not an insult. It's often a good idea to set clear expectations so that everyone remembers what was agreed upon. Even the closest of relationships often have agreements that are signed. Think of prenuptial agreements when people get married. They outline who owned assets before the marriage. Also, when people die, they oftentimes have a will that dictates what happens with their assets. So in summary, take some time and some thought as to how you're going to handle the agreements in your company, especially if it's a service-based business. And again, make sure you get the advice of a good attorney and a good accountant to help you out, because everything that I've said is generic from my experience. You'll be able to get good specific advice from an attorney or an accountant. Thank you so much for joining us today, and make sure you check out the next video about contracts where I'm going to get into specific things that I've used in my contracts that have been very helpful. This was a little bit more generic. Thanks again for joining us. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. We also have a Facebook and Instagram page. I hope you'll follow and like. Till next time, thank you.